Thank you for that lovely and very warm introduction. I'm going to try and share the screen if that's all right. So just give me a moment. I've just got a few slides that I'm going to be sharing with you tonight. So let me get that going. And with a bit of luck, it'll work for us. Okay, how's that? Can everyone see that all right? Is that coming through, Anne? Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, that's coming through.
Beautiful. Excellent.
It's muted, haven't they? I'll just mute my.
Lovely. All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for being here tonight. I know with everything going on, as we were hearing from you all, it's hard to probably commit to yet another Zoom meeting, but hopefully the topic tonight will keep you all engaged, and I'm really looking forward to some lively discussion at the end, which I would love. And also throughout the session, I'll give you a few moments to pause as well, just to, sometimes a talk like this can go very fast and there's a lot of thoughts going on in your head. So I will give you moments just to pause and think through some of the questions I pose or some of the kind of topics that I raise with you. Yeah, feel free to ask those questions at the end or make comments as well. I always love to hear those too. So a few months ago, I did a talk for a prominent girls' school in Sydney on the topic of sex. And by far the most common question was along the lines of, doesn't the Bible discourage sexuality, and particularly female sexuality? Aren't your beliefs and career contradictory? Just like what Anne was saying at the beginning, there's often a real negative overlay between sexuality and Christianity. Another question was, how is abstinence and other Christian concepts around sex even relevant in a modern world? And this perspective is not unusual. Even in the course that I was studying at university, we got taught that Christianity, along with colonialism and capitalism, was the enemy of healthy sexuality. So that was being taught at a university level. And so somehow the way that the Christian perspective on sexuality has been portrayed to the world has left people thinking that God is outdated, anti-pleasure, sex negative, and sexist, and that really people have to choose between having a relationship with this old school God or having a good sex life. And I'm just going to see if I can do the next slide here. And really, what a clever false dichotomy for the devil to set up, to hijack this beautiful and powerful part of our humanity. Because ultimately, sexual intimacy is one of the closest representations we have to the deep transformational unity that we enjoy with Christ as his bride, the church, him in us and us in him. So when sex is only seen in the negative, through the lens of manipulation, power, abuse, and domination, or when the emphasis is on sexual sin, infidelity, sex and porn addiction, sexual abuse, and hate speech aimed at sexual minorities, we actually get quite distracted from the goodness of sex, whilst mudding and confusing people's ability to see a good and loving God that desires his people with all his heart and longs for communion. And also a God that designs sex to be good and enjoyable. The profound hypocrisy that can exist within the church also tends to create a blanket of shame that undermines any positive message that we may have and sends Christians into hiding when it comes to any conversation around this topic. And it also explains why sex sells and why our society is so sex obsessed, because it's the closest that people get outside of a relationship with God to this sort of powerful communion and intimacy. And for us Christians, it's really easy to get stuck between these two worlds, isn't it? The highly sexualized secular world that seemingly shows us what real, amazing sex could look like, and a silent, shaming Christian world that leads us to continually question our desires and sexual expression, with a lot about what not to do, but very little input as to how to embrace our own sexuality. And when that happens, the outcome is often sexual dysfunction and breakdown in marriages, confusion, a sense of inadequacy, guilt, stuckness, and sometimes even resentment towards yourself, partner, or God. And that's what I see in my clinic. And that's what I'm really here to address today. And I want to talk about sex, not in the context of what not to do, but what to do. How to understand the Christian vision of healthy sexuality so people can enjoy wonderful, fulfilling sex lives. Because in the end, we need to strengthen, protect, and reinforce Christian relationships by deeply understanding what good, biblically informed, healthy sex looks like, that is protective against violence, fosters sexual well-being, and opens up honest and open dialogue. And at the same time, we need to also be sharing this beautiful vision of sex to the world in such a way that it breaks down preconceived ideas linked to judgment, guilt, and shame, and introduces them to the freedom, grace, and intimacy on offer from God, regardless of their sexual status. So as Kanishka Raphael, Anglican Archbishop of Australia, said recently on an interview, our sexual secular world is failing us. What we have come to define as freedom and liberty really has enslaved us. When the gospel came into the world, the sexual ethic was of pure gratification and expression of male power. But the gospel changed that, and might I add, continues to fight that in our culture today, making sexuality for the mutual expression of love and commitment in a covenanted relationship. The gospel has located its sexual ethics not in a social order of men or women or power, but in a cosmic order mirroring Jesus' faithfulness to his bride. And you know, he's right. Christians have a wonderful message to share. The secular vision of sex with its hookup culture is actually letting people down. And we're seeing that now in the media as people try to grapple with how to address this. But, you know, consent is only a small part of it. The bigger part of the conversation is how we can live with the contradiction that on the one hand, sex is purely recreational and fun and doesn't have to mean much, with the embodied experience of sex actually meaning a lot, that people can be hurt and violated and carry deep wounds from seemingly innocent experiences that didn't go to plan. Sex carries far more weight than we're acknowledging, and deep down we all know it. And that is because, as we know as Christians, sex was created to be so much more. And whether we like it or not, we cannot go against the innate design woven within us, where sex is for the bonding of two lives, not only about pleasure between two bodies. And so while we may be able to convince our minds, the experience is stored in the body, and there's actually often no denying that. And so I see person after person coming into my clinic, often with some part of their dysfunction linked to unhelpful expectations and misleading concepts from the way that the world portrays sex. And the interesting thing is that I actually don't have to convince them that sex goes beyond the physical to a deeper connection. They're actually the ones telling me that they know the emptiness of pursuing purely pleasure, and they want more. They're the ones realizing their need for safety and commitment to enjoy sexual intimacy and growing relationships. So while the world is trying to convince us that the Christian sexual ethic is outdated and limiting, cultural discourse cannot always replace the human experience and the way that we're each wired, both physically and psychologically. And I also want to add that sexual dysfunction can also come about from unhelpful expectations and misleading concepts from the way that we as Christians understand what the Bible has to say about sex too. So what is the helpful interpretation of scriptures that I'm talking about? And where are these positive messages relating to sex in the Bible? Well, I thought I might talk about these messages in a slightly different way today. It's actually through the lens of a case study, which represents, to some extent, many of the Christian couples that I see. So I'm going to outline a situation between a couple called Bob and Mary, and then I'm going to talk about how the Bible speaks beautifully into this space and how sometimes theology can be misunderstood to create these problems. And hopefully, as we go on, you'll also see how much of what the Bible has to say isn't just good news for Christians, but for people outside of the church as well. So we start with Bob and Mary. Bob and Mary are a beautiful Christian couple. They get married and they're very excited to finally be having sex. They waited a long time for this. Bob and Mary go in believing that sex is a good and necessary part of a relationship. It's other person centered. And if you don't engage in it, there's a higher chance the partner may stray. And that's taken from, some of the verses in Corinthians and through the Bible, where Paul is encouraging couples to have sex. So Mary, now Mary has been told it will probably hurt, that guys need it more than girls. She knows nothing about her body or arousal, or even whether she likes something or not. She feels sex is a bit dirty or wrong, even though she knows that's not true in her head. She feels uncomfortable talking about sex and doesn't even know what words to use when talking about her body. So she doesn't say much during sex. And she feels that her own sexual pleasure feels a bit selfish anyway. As for Bob, he wants to make it really good for Mary and is afraid of hurting her. He feels nervous after seeing what he thinks sex should look like on films or the occasional porn video. And he feels like it's his job to initiate. So I'm just going to flip forward to the next thing. So the experience for Mary in the first few years is not that great and doesn't live up to all she was hoping it would be. She feels broken and frustrated. However, Mary thinks, even if I'm not enjoying it, I still need to do it at all costs to keep the relationship healthy and for the sake of Bob's sexual need. She thinks, if I don't do this, I'll be responsible for letting down this part of our relationship, and he may look elsewhere, and it'll be partly my fault. I love him, and I don't want that. I'm just going to make it all about him, grit my teeth and bear it, hoping that one day it will get better. But of course it doesn't, especially once their kids come along and things get very busy, and she's now extremely exhausted. The experience for Bob is okay, but he can tell Mary's not enjoying it. He doesn't know what to do to make it better. He asks her questions, tries to do new things, but she feels more pressure and it leads to more fights. And after a while, he feels guilty initiating sex or asking for certain things because it feels selfish when she doesn't seem to be having fun. And often she has an excuse for not wanting it anyway. Sex becomes occasional. Bob feels rejected. Doesn't she want me like I want her? I really want her just to want me. And so then in the long term, and this is often where I see them, I am seeing couples a little bit younger now in that earlier stage, but for many of my couples, this is where they land. So after some time for Mary, sex for Mary becomes a place she services her partner like a chore, a place that she endures pain and discomfort, a place she lets her mind disconnect from, something to move through as fast as possible, something to avoid by busying herself, and something so scary that she even avoids affection for fear that it leads to more sex than she can handle. And sex for Bob becomes anxiety-provoking, a place of guilt and shame, a place of sexual frustration, and something that causes him to doubt himself, which also seems to make him less attractive to Mary. And after a number of years, Mary becomes resentful, hurt, trapped, ashamed, angry. She feels broken. She sometimes sends those feelings outward towards Bob, calling him sex-obsessed, or inwards towards herself, thinking violent thoughts and wishing she could go without sex for the rest of her life. Bob becomes confused, sad, grieved, frustrated, helpless, depressed, guilty, and angry. Bob can't live like this and wishes Mary were different. And he can't talk about it, so he secretly turns to porn or a casual relationship. Is discovered, and often if they're in positions of leadership, he has to stand down from his leadership position and doesn't return to church, and neither does Mary. So can you see how easily things went off the rails for Bob and Mary? And just take a moment to think about where you would start here. What could have helped them avoid this path? And feel free to we can chat about this towards the end. And this could have, also I just want to say, it could be reversed too. I also see couples where the guy is actually the one experiencing the lower libido and desire, perhaps even erectile issues leading to similar avoidance pattern that you see here in this example. So let's start out with just laying out a healthy Christian framework. As I said, I'm going to be talking about the positive vision, but what the Bible has to say is good news for a couple like this. So in Timothy chapter 4, verse 4, it reads, "For everything created by God is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is to be received with thanksgiving." And the last part of Proverbs here, "Let her breast fill you at all times with delight, be intoxicated always in her love." So here we can see God is clearly for sex because he created it. And because he created it, by definition, it's good. But I also want to highlight something else here. Do you notice that there's nothing about intercourse in the second sexual reference? It doesn't say, "Let intercourse fill you at all times with delight." Rather, it references another aspect of sexual behavior, which I think is quite telling. It's really easy to get caught up on sex being only about intercourse, but really, sex is more like a banquet, and intercourse is just one dish on the table, but there's so much more to enjoy. And so often couples tell me the best sex life they had was actually before marriage. And it's often because they indulged in all these other dishes, but intercourse. And when they got married, they became fixated on one dish, and then they wondered why their sex life became so bland. So I think this verse is encouraging us to look beyond that to delighting in a variety of sexual intimacy and activities together. And for Mary and Bob, many of their initial issues arose from feeling like every sexual interaction they had to end in intercourse, which was not only uncomfortable for Mary, but also a lot of effort for both of them in the busy lives that they led. So if they had diversified a little and had the freedom to enjoy other aspects of their sexuality, it might not have felt like as much of a chore, and both might have been able to enjoy the experience. Now, the next passage I want to take you to is 1 Corinthians 13. And this is a biblical definition of love, which I'm sure many of us are familiar with. And when we stop to think about it, sex is a physical embodied expression of love. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out this passage, and instead of love, I'm going to read it out as making love is. And just notice what stands out to you as you listen, and think about what the hopeful message is here for both maybe you or even for the world, the broader world around us. So the way I make love is patient. It is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered, and it keeps no record of wrongs. The way I make love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Making love never fails. I'll just give you a moment just to think and reflect on that. Notice what stands out to you as you read it. I think it's a beautiful framework to understand and work on within your own relationships, especially if you're wanting to introduce something new or you're exploring. It's a great way to ask yourself, is it going to be loving in all these ways? So you can also see from this verse that sex arises from a place of kindness. It's not boastful, it's patient and persevering, it's protective. It's not used to enact violence or done in anger. It's not self-seeking, it doesn't dishonor another, it allows for forgiveness, it rejoices with the truth, and it never fails. So for Bob and Mary, it was important that they were honest about what they were feeling and patient with one another and persevering rather than angry and frustrated and with an overall sense of failure in their sex life that ultimately led to avoidance. The Bible says making love never fails, which makes me also consider, are we measuring a successful sex life by God's measures or the world's measures? Now, the third aspect of this I want to address is Mary's fear of knowing. The third aspect of this I want to address is, Mary's fear of knowing her body and fear of initiating sex and taking an almost passive role in sex. And I know that the Bible was written at a time when women had very few rights and were treated as property, and where sexual pleasure for men was often found outside of the marriage, and sex was for procreation within marriage. But this is a fascinating thing. The Bible is radically countercultural in communicating concepts such as man and woman equally made in God's image, mutual submission, and mutual sexual enjoyment. I mean, it's only been the last 30 years that our culture now has finally taken women's sexual pleasure seriously. And here we have the Bible, more than 2,000 years old, already there. So let's have a read of this first passage from Song of Songs and have a look at what we find here. So in the very first verse of the first chapter, it's the woman that begins the conversation. She says, "Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth." And later, "Take me away with you. Let us hurry. Let the king bring me into his chambers." So what do we see here? We see a woman boldly desiring and initiating sex, not being a passive recipient of her lover's desire. She's also vocal about what she wants. She wants kisses. She wants to be taken into the chamber, and she asks for it. She later seeks after it, putting her own safety at risk, and brings him back to her mother's house. In other words, she's an active participant in the process, desiring, initiating, communicating her wants, and even leading. But amidst her request and initiation, in chapter 2, verse 4, she also lets herself be led to the banquet hall to be nourished by him. And you see this in healthy sex lives, a mutual dance between both people where they almost lead each other, which is a space I like to build on for couples, the giving and the receiving. She says, "My beloved is mine and I am his." And then they continue taking turns, even in talking. He speaks, she speaks, he speaks, she speaks. There's this mutual belonging and no power dynamic here that indicates that she's there to serve him alone in sex while her pleasure takes the back seat. They're also unashamedly attracted to each other's physical form, which is so interesting because for some Christians I meet, there is almost guilt that they could be so superficial as to point out their partner's good looks, that it needs to always be about their heart. But here we see the opposite, raw appreciation for the physical form. And might I add for the woman, a positive sense of self that cuts across stereotypical concepts of beauty. She actually affirms her physical form, despite the fact that in the culture of her time, being dark was indicative of hard labor under the sun. So she actually says, "Dark am I, yet lovely." And then she allows herself to hear her partner talk about her coloring as a thing of beauty, being like a young mare among Pharaoh's chariot horses. And this is so important because sometimes as women, we get caught up in what we think we should look like and lose sight of how our partner sees us and that it's okay to look different from stereotypical concepts of beauty to a concept of beauty that actually represents diversity and tells a story of hard work and courage. And lastly, she doesn't get caught up on only using her sight to foster desire and pleasure. She actually uses her 5 senses. She smells him, she tastes him, she hears him, she brings her arousal to him as a gift. We have access to so many ways to be aroused, but rarely delve into them. And this would also be an area I would work with when it came to Mary and Bob. Now, another aspect I'd like to hone in on is the concept of mutuality of pleasure, because I think Bob and Mary were missing a huge part of understanding here. And to address this, I'd like to go to Ephesians chapter 5, verse 21 to 33. I know we're jumping around the Bible quite a bit. And this verse, it can often be a contentious verse in discussing healthy Christian relationship dynamics. But this is actually how I understand it. In the very first sentence, the context is set, submit to one another. There is an emphasis on mutual submission. But it looks different between the husband and the wife. For the wife, it is like the church submits to Christ. And for the husband, it is still submission, but in the form of love and self-sacrifice, like Christ does for the church. But here is the rub. In the very next sentence, there is this strange reference to the way that loving a wife is like loving oneself. But why, you ask? Well, the next verse explains it beautifully. Because the two become one flesh. Willing submission to one another creates a unity that means that it's not about a me, it's not about a you, but it's about an us. It involves the recognition that what affects me actually affects you as well. And I meet so many clients like Mary that I feel like, they feel like it's their job to relinquish their body and pleasure and make it all about meeting their partner's sexual need. But here's the catch. Because in sex, two become one, the system breaks down if one is giving but not receiving at the same time. The partner who is receiving, like Bob, will soon realize their inability to give to their partner which robs them of part of the joy of the experience. How can Bob possibly enjoy Mary's giving if it feels so one-sided? And so I get people coming to me saying, I just want my partner to sexually want me. I want them. But of course, they can't control that. And the sexual interaction starts to break down. And so my job is to actually slow things right down and find a place where both people are enjoying the interaction. So the system of unity that we see here in the Bible can get back up and running again. And with their permission, I'd like to read out a quote from one of my client couples who were struggling in their relationship, just like Bob and Mary. He had a higher sex drive than his wife, and she had become quite shut down to sex, seeing it as a chore and gritting her teeth and bearing it. And this was actually a breakthrough they had just a few weeks ago. For the guy, this is what he said in the session. He said, I realize I have to submit my desire for us. I have to submit my desire for us. The us trumps the me. I'm choosing to put us ahead of me. What we were doing before helped no one. So instead, I let go of my actual desires to be open to new desires, to let them grow. And I discovered they were more satisfying to me anyway. And now the thing that I desire is your want. I don't want my wants if you don't want it. Isn't that beautiful? And then there was a beautiful moment. The girl listened to this, right? And this is what she said back. She said, I realized that the thing my partner wants most is my genuine desire, not the action itself. But he wants me, who I am, and the intimacy of that. This is what it means to be set free and given hope. I no longer have to feel the pressure of doing what I don't want to do and having to choose between me and him, but I choose us. Now, just take a moment here to notice any similarities to the relationship that we're called to have with God, the vertical relationship. So this is a reflection of what's happening between man and woman in the sexual space. But I want to point out two things here. God asks us to submit our desires to him, the selfish desires and rigid plans that we have for our own life, and to open ourselves up to a mutual space where there is union with his spirit. The us trumps the me. And it's here that we can let new desires grow so that the very thing God desires, we also desire, where our will is aligned with his. So much so that we get to a point where we can honestly say, you know what, God, I don't want my wants if you don't want it. The other important similarity here is in what the girl says. God, time after time in the Bible says, I don't want your empty actions. He wants to be genuinely desired. He longs for authentic intimacy. And so do we, even if we don't recognize it. And he desires that we know him better. So furthermore, like the girl in the example above, I think it's important to reflect on, can we also rob ourselves of joy and pleasure in our relationship with God by seeing it as a duty, an obligation that eventually leads to resentment and burnout? What if we were to spend more time receiving the joy that comes from understanding what we have in our relationship with God, a deeper understanding of it, and then a longing for more? And if you are single and listening to this talk, this part is equally relevant to you as it is to the married couples. The church narrative is so often, don't be sexual, don't feel desires, don't have a body that wants sex, don't see yourself as a sexual person, as if marriage is the only answer. But the biblical narrative says that sex is actually about teaching us about who God is and his desire for us. And marriage is just one temporary and imperfect version of this that echoes Jesus' relationship with his bride, the church. But if you're single, you get to demonstrate this very same concept in probably a more profound way that truly echoes the relationship that we'll all have eventually. One where we submit our own selfish desires to pick up God's plan for our lives and walk in step with the Spirit. And you get to show us what that actually looks like, to have deep longings and desires met in authentic intimacy with God. And that is such an important role in the church and so important for the world to see. Let me read out a modified quote from Spurgeon that is powerful. And I just want you to take a moment to really allow these words to enter into your consciousness and just note what you feel in your body as a result. I cannot please God without bringing myself a great amount of happiness. For if I please God, It is because God accepts me as his son or daughter, gives me the blessings of adoption, pours upon me the bounties of his grace, makes me a blessed person in this life, and ensures me a crown of everlasting life. How many of us actually allow ourselves to remember that and really feel the joy within our bodies of what that means? How well do we take a moment to feel the pleasure of relationship with God and sitting at his feet like Mary? Or do we get caught up with Martha-like martyrdom, the suffering servant only looking forward to life after death? God isn't against embodied pleasure so long as it does not become an idol, something to be pursued above and beyond him. So have a think about what genuine desire looks like with God and how to foster that and open yourself up to receiving the joy of what that means. And finally, I want to talk to you about the positive message that can be found in the Bible in dealing with sexual sin and shame, which is sadly where it led to for Bob in our case study, and also a lot of shame for Mary too. Of course, there are verses in the Bible that caution against various forms of sexual sin. But the more important message is the fact that God's sexual ethic when it comes to sexuality is too high for any of us to keep. I mean, if you merely think about a woman lustfully, you've already committed adultery. In other words, God's sexual ethic goes beyond the action to the heart, and we have very little control over that part of us, especially when it comes to sex. And so that's why we're all on a level playing field here. And that's the very first thing Jesus highlights when the Pharisees bring a woman who'd been caught in sexual adultery before Jesus. He says, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw the stone at her." So he encourages the judges to go inwards to recognize their own sin before judging. He then says, "Neither do I condemn you," because as we know from Romans chapter 1, verse 8, there is no condemnation for those of you in Christ Jesus, but a relationship of unconditional acceptance where we can be free of shame and where we can hear God's call, "Where are you?" Where we can come out from behind the bushes that we're hiding in, like Adam and Eve after they ate the apple, and walk once again with God. And this is the place of true transformation. And only then is it possible to go and sin no more, which was the final part of what Jesus told her. And that's the order that we need to recognize when we're encouraging someone in this space. First, the space of humility in recognizing our own sin, encouraging them towards reaching out to God and to be free from condemnation, and then supporting them to go and sin no more, not the other way around. In other words, Bob and Mary really needed to be reminded of Jesus' love for them, to reach out to him for help, knowing that they were free from condemnation, but with the power of the Spirit, able to face their challenges from a place of loving, unconditional acceptance, rather than crippling shame and guilt. As Serene Jones, president of Union Theological Seminary, writes, "Our concepts of sexual sin should never be fashioned or deployed in a manner designed to harm people, break their spirits, to marginalize them or destroy their sense of belovedness or constrain the conditions of their flourishing." And she's right. Rather, it should point us and others towards our desperate need for Jesus and the hope of being in a living and transformational relationship with our Creator. His death makes way for change at the heart level and a freedom from sexual sin and shame. And this is the good news that we need to share with others. For we know that our old self was crucified with him so that the body ruled by sin might be done away with, that we should no longer be slaves to sin, because anyone who has died has been set free from sin. For sin shall no longer be your master, because you are not under the law, but under grace. Romans chapter 6, verse 6 to 14. And there's I kind of shorten that verse a little to make it easier to read in this session. So in summary, this is what I want you to take away from today as to how the Bible is good news to us personally and the broader world around us. Sex is not bad. It's not a sin in and of itself. In fact, it was good and created by God as well as our bodies. Sex is not limited to intercourse. The intimacy we long for in sex points to the relational intimacy that is possible with Jesus. And we must remember that amidst many distractions that blur our ability to see the beauty of this intimacy. Sex is a physical expression of love and exists in a context of humility, kindness, protection, and patience that honors the other and results in truth and joy. We see that the Bible is revolutionary in terms of what it has to say about women's pleasure. It models a boldness to desire and initiate, to communicate what we love about ourselves and our partner, to lead and be led in pleasure, to not let culture or religious discourse disconnect us from the beauty of our bodies or from admiring our partner's body. And it demonstrates how we can open ourselves up to the five senses to engage with pleasure in sexuality. We also see how sex in the Bible is all about mutuality and how important it is that sex be a place that you go to together as something by the couple, for the couple, not for one person in the couple. And finally, it recognizes our shortfalls in this space and speaks hope into our shame. We can use the challenges we face to draw us closer to Him, not to hide from Him, to appreciate our need for something bigger than ourselves, and to find unconditional acceptance and grace there and nowhere else. So lean into your struggles and be curious about what they reveal about what you're truly needing from God. And I just wanted to say, if any of Bob and Mary's story resonates, don't hesitate to reach out for help from a sexologist such as myself, or a couples therapist that specializes in doing work in the sexual realm. There's always help available. And I also want you to take a moment to think about how you are uniquely positioned to apply some of these concepts that we've discussed to enhance the spaces that you're each involved in. It might be in thinking through how we teach a topic better in our churches, or even how to apply these concepts personally to enhance sexual and relational wellness, or even how we talk about it publicly. Either way, my hope is that amidst the dark world that we live in, full of brokenness, confusion, fear, and loneliness, that you're able to shine a brighter spotlight on God's beautiful vision for sexuality and relationships.